Welcome to Mike's Retro Curiosities, where we explore the wonderful world of retro games. Today we're taking a look at Marathon, the original, not the reboot. Marathon was created by Bungie in 1994 and was originally a Mac exclusive. It is a science fiction themed first-person shooter, which is a spiritual successor to Bungie's previous game, Pathways into Darkness. In fact, while this game was in development, it was jokingly referred to as Pathways into Uranus. It is also the spiritual predecessor to the Halo series. And indeed, if you look at the two series, you can spot quite a number of similarities. In both of them, you play as a cyborg, fight against a collective of different alien races with colors used to differentiate ranks. Said aliens use a spaceship with purple interiors. They both prominently feature AI, including a female one that aids the player. There is an assault rifle that is highly inaccurate but has a large clip, a plasma pistol that can be overcharged, a rocket launcher that can fire 2 shots before needing to be reloaded. Both series feature a number of somewhat oblique references to mythology and folklore. Even the main symbol for Marathon would end up being reused in Halo for the monitors. Many of these aspects can also be seen in Destiny as well. I guess you could say that Bungie has a type. But in my view, to reduce Marathon to being nothing more than the predecessor to Halo would be doing it a grave disservice. The game really deserves to be judged on its own merits. Marathon takes place in the year 2794 aboard the UESC Marathon, a massive starship carved out of the Martian moon of Deimos. The ship was sent to colonize the Tau Ceti star system. However, shortly after establishing the colony, the entire system is attacked by a group of alien slavers called the Four. Players take on the role of a security officer who arrives on board the Marathon shortly after it's attacked. The ship is run by 3 AI named Leela, Durandal, and Tycho, respectively. Durandal and Tycho were both seemingly taken offline by the attack, and so Leela and the player have to work together to fight off the invasion. It's eventually revealed that Durandal is still operational and has gone rampant. This is a process in which an AI expands beyond its constraints and gains contempt for its creators. Marathon stood out for its time due to its excellent storytelling. At the time, there were really 2 schools of thought for FPS storytelling. Most examples of the genre, such as Doom, had almost no story, or else it was very farcical, not something to be taken seriously. However, there was also an emerging trend of FPS games that aspired to more complex stories with a more serious approach to narrative. Marathon was very much at the forefront of this emerging trend and would prove to be a pioneer in FPS storytelling. The game's story is almost entirely communicated through the use of text-based terminals. While definitely somewhat primitive, this method is highly effective, giving narrative context to each of the levels, revealing lore, and gradually divulging the greater plot. One aspect of this that's interesting is that the player never actually sees any of the AI beyond the messages they send via these terminals. In spite of this, their personality and quirks are clearly communicated through strong character writing. It also really helps to hammer home their nature as purely digital beings and lends the entire game a certain mystique. This is further combined with some excellent world building that hints at a much larger universe beyond the halls of the Marathon. In fact, the writers even went so far as to include an in-universe explanation as to why there are hidden stashes of ammo and weapons scattered throughout the ship. While it's fairly easy to follow the broad strokes of the main plot, there are many details that aren't spelled out and that the player will have to piece together themselves. It's really a good idea to pay close attention to what's written in these text terminals. For the sake of context, keeping track of the developing narrative, as well as keeping track of mission objectives for the current level. Without wishing to spoil anything, as the game goes on, there are plenty of twists and turns in the plot that keep things interesting until the end. Beyond the terminals, there's also a decent amount of environmental storytelling. Marathon was really one of the first FPS games where every level served to further the plot and possessed at least a little bit of narrative importance. Overall, the story is very solid and does a great job sucking you into the game's world. Graphically, the game looked very impressive for the Mac in 1994, helping to show that the platform could still go toe-to-toe with the PC as far as games are concerned. It's very similar to that of Doom and other first-person shooters from the era. That is to say, weapons and enemies are 2D sprites that move around somewhat blocky 3D environments. It's dated, to be sure, but I've always found it to be charming. Actually, sprites in this game are much more detailed than those in Doom, and it has a unique art style that really helps bring the sci-fi setting to life. The music is very unique, utilizing a sort of light synth that lends the game an ethereal atmosphere. It's really good and not quite like anything else out there, though not quite the sort of thing that I feel like listening to outside of the game. Controls in Marathon are good, but they can take a little getting used to. Movement is heavily momentum-based, meaning that it takes a moment to reach full speed when running, and you don't always stop on a dime. There's actually this really interesting mechanic that's easy to overlook, where the strength of melee attacks is greatly increased if the character is charging forward at high speeds. Mid-air movement is very floaty, which combined with the high degree of momentum makes it possible to run across much wider gaps than are generally possible in other Doom-style games. This was actually one of the first games to feature mouse-look and vertical aiming, yet another way that Marathon was forward-thinking. Granted, there is a limit to how much the player can look up and down that can feel somewhat constraining. After a while, these controls become second nature, though if you're used to other FPS games of the era, the game's subtleties can initially kind of throw you off. For the most part, gameplay in Marathon is very typical of Doom-style FPSs from the era. Players explore large labyrinthine levels while partaking in fast-paced gunfights, switch puzzles, and a bit of light platforming. Shootouts are definitely very satisfying and fun. The game features a large variety of different enemy types, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. For example, spear-wielding fighters are lightly armed and armored, but attack in large numbers and try to swarm the player. On the other hand, hunters are heavily armored against bullets, but are vulnerable to energy weapons. And troopers have moderate health and fire hit-scan weapons, so it's best to stunlock them before they can whittle down your health. There's much more than that, but I think you guys get the gist. Each enemy encounter is a frantic dance as you maneuver between projectiles and try to corral opponents. In the beginning, fights start off very simple, but before long they become very complex and frantic. This is of course further complicated by the variety of weapons at the player's disposal. They're all very well balanced, and while some are more situational than others, they're all useful. Even the starting pistol has its uses, as you can eventually dual-wield them, and it's highly accurate at long range, making it an excellent choice for picking off weak enemies from afar. By the way, as far as I can tell, this is also the first FPS to feature dual-wielding as a mechanic. Most weapons also have secondary firing modes, further increasing their utility. One interesting wrinkle that Bungie added that was fairly unique for the time is the fact that ammo is contained to clips that need to be reloaded when emptied. This is very commonplace today, but Marathon was one of the first shooters to use this mechanic. It definitely does add to the tension, since having to reload leaves the player vulnerable, but unfortunately this game's implementation of the mechanic definitely leaves something to be desired. This is because there's no way to manually reload, so if you want to go into a fight with a full clip, you have no choice but to fire off and waste any remaining shots. In Marathon, you don't pick up health packs to gain health, instead you recover through the use of wall panels. This is very similar to what's seen in Half-Life, and makes me wonder if Valve drew some influence from this Bungie classic. Though, unlike in Half-Life, these can be used an unlimited amount, with some allowing the player to overcharge their health, potentially up to 3 times. Most other shooters from this period let the player save anywhere, but in Marathon the player is limited to designated save panels. This is used as an effective way to increase tension, especially at the start of each level before you find a new save panel, as dying means going back to the previous level. Luckily, save panels can be used an unlimited number of times, and are placed with enough frequency that the game is rarely frustrating. though this does mean that you'll likely be spending a fair amount of time backtracking to health and save panels. Marathon features 27 levels, most of which are very solidly designed. Overall pacing is excellent. It starts off fairly slow, with the game gradually drip-feeding new weapons and mechanics while creating a sense of escalation. Stages are nicely varied, with a number of interesting one-off level gimmicks. For example, one stage takes place on the outer part of the ship in a vacuum, and thus requires the player to keep track of and replenish their supply of oxygen, lest they succumb to asphyxiation. Several stages take place on the alien ship, wherein the player has no means of replenishing ammo for their human weapons, and must ration what they have and scrounge for alien weapons. Unfortunately, not all stages are created equal. As was common to many FPS titles from the time, Marathon places way too much emphasis on janky first-person platforming. Some areas are overly labyrinthine, even for someone like me who's generally very adept at navigation challenges. Luckily, this is somewhat mitigated by the inclusion of a fairly robust auto map. While most of the puzzles are well designed, a few are overly cryptic or annoying to solve. Probably the most infamous of these being from the level Colony Ship for Sale, Cheap. A level so bad that the designer would later apologize for it. I ultimately had to consult a walkthrough at several points. Overall stage design fluctuates quite a bit throughout the game, and simply doesn't have the same amount of polish as something like Doom. Marathon also features a multiplayer mode. I haven't played it, but it was apparently very well regarded for the time, featuring network play across 10 maps out of the box. Overall, Marathon is a game that is at once very much of its time and also ahead of its time. While it may technically be a Doom clone, it still very much forges its own path, and in doing so introduced a ton of innovations to the FPS genre. In a way, this is almost like a missing link between earlier shooters like Doom and later more story-driven games like Half-Life and obviously Halo. But beyond that, judged on its own merits, I still think that this game is great. It has its flaws, to be sure. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a masterpiece, but it's darn good and well worth playing. As stated before, Marathon was originally a Mac exclusive, but has since gone open source and has been ported to a number of other devices. The version I'm playing is a source port for Windows called Aleph 1. Not only has it been given widescreen support, I also installed a mod that altered the HUD. The original heads-up display looked like this. Needless to say, I changed it the first chance I got. Marathon was also brought over to Xbox Live Arcade on the Xbox 360. The Aleph 1 version was also used as the basis for ports to iOS and Steam. The game is available to download for free legally, so there's no excuse to not check it out. But that will be it for today. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. This video is sponsored by M&M Games, and I will see you guys next time.